When there's a tragedy, like the tragedy in the earthquake in Syria and in Turkey, there is, first of all, there's a need to respond with help. And also, we have to try to make sense of it, right? Theologically, that can be problematic because it's important not to say things like people suffer because they deserve it. This is something that occasionally happens where everyone will say, oh, it's part of God's great plan. So the suffering of thousands and thousands and thousands of people who seem to have nothing to deserve it, we're suddenly justifying their punishment, which really sort of makes God into what in human terms would be a moral monster. You don't want to get caught in that trap, nor is it worth sort of saying, well, it must all be meaningless, so there must be no reason to think of any transcendent order to the universe. Really, the Jewish tradition deals with this a number of different ways, but one is by understanding that the one God has different attributes that we experience at different times. The God of nature we call Elohim, God, which meaning an amoral sense of dealing with the world. Plate tectonics is how the earth is put together, and it isn't a moral force. There is no morality to plate tectonics. It just causes plates to move, which occasionally triggers what we experience as earthquakes, and they don't check whether or not you gave money to the orphanage or whether you embezzled from the orphanage. It just is, and it doesn't check. Floods, earthquakes, these things, they're just part of the natural order. The world works the way the world works, and it's an amoral force in that sense. It doesn't recognize morality. The name of God that we call on, that we call Adonai, Yud-He Vav-He, that's the name that we call on for the world, not as it is, but as it ought to be. That's what calls us to what we ought to be doing and how we respond to the world as it is. This week in Parshat Yitro, you see both names being used, but what calls us to a moral life is that second one. So recognize the world as it is, and that we're not supposed to judge harshly those who suffer. Quite the opposite. We're supposed to help them because that's the world as it ought to be. Recognize the world as it is and recognize the world as it ought to be. It's that second one that really forms the lure for our behavior, and make sure that we don't wallow in some sort of theological justification for what happens, but rather look for justification to act to help those who are in need. Shabbat Shalom.